I've got a bit of a sickness accent right now, but needs must. Trigger warnings for religious trauma, religious abuse, CSA, rape, blood, racism, and Islamophobia. Spoiler warnings for Midnight Mass, The Exorcist, the film from 1973, The Exorcist, the television show from 2016, and The Exorcism of Emily Rose. In Roger Ebert's review of John Carpenter's Vampires, he said, "When it comes to fighting vampires and performing exorcisms, the Roman Catholic Church has the heavy artillery. Your other religions are good for everyday theological tasks, like steering their members into heaven. But when the undead lunge up out of their graves, you want a priest on the case." Catholicism and vampires are not a modern union. In Dracula, the foundation on which most modern vampire mythos has been laid, the vampire-hunting Van Helsing is a man of faith, weaponizing all manner of Catholic tools like a sort of holy Batman utility belt. Jonathan Harker, the Anglican protagonist, has to overcome his Protestant assertion that such things are idolatrous superstition, though they do still work for him, seemingly regardless of denomination. The choice to make Catholicism the ultimate anti-vampire weapon is interesting, as Bram Stoker himself was raised Protestant, his family devout members of the Church of Ireland, a branch of Anglicanism.
You have to have faith for this to work on me, Mr. Vincent. Stop!
Sacred Catholic items aren't the only weapons of faith that have been utilized against Dracula. In the fantastically bad American Hong Kong film, The Legend of the Seven Golden Vampires, Dracula is successfully fended off by an image of the Buddha, which proves just as effective as a crucifix.
You found a new toy?
No. Not a toy.
I don't know, is it?
Well, the story goes that a mad Norwegian vampire hunter went to India, and he convinced the weapons master of the Rajaputra clans to make him this thing. There's only one. I saw drawings of it in my mother's books. The real question is, how it ended up here. See? Sign of the cross.
Mm-hmm. Did the vampire hunter die in India? Because Hindu vampires wouldn't have the faintest idea why he was waving a cross at them.
Actually, no. You see, vampires are basically an evolved predator species, so their eyesight is pretty different to ours. Turns out that if you put a big geometric shape right up close in their field of vision, it confuses the shit out of their brains and, makes them panic.
But while there are certainly many horror movies involving a religion, or religions, that aren't Catholicism, they aren't what I'll be discussing. Let's talk about Midnight Mass. When I was young, the allure of Midnight Mass was palpable. I got to stay up past midnight, and sometimes there were cookies and hot chocolate at the end. It was one of the few times a year that going to church didn't feel like a chore. I remember vividly the way the stained glass windows shifted under flickering candlelight, and how even the choir sounded darker without the usual sunlight streaming in. Once, while visiting some cousins for Christmas, they attended Midnight Mass with us for the first time. This side of the family wasn't religious, and my cousins, all teenagers at the time, were noticeably disturbed. The practices which I had been raised with for my whole life, and which were exceedingly, even boringly normal to me, were to them a series of eerie and off-putting behaviors. They were unnerved by the way we all spoke at the same time, speaking intermittently in English and Latin, all in the same vaguely rhythmic monotone. They were unnerved by the lack of light, the dozens of candles outlining the service in shadow. They were unnerved by the act of communion. It did not matter that the body was only thin wafer and the blood watered down wine. It was the idea of it that bothered them. And I understand why. The metaphorical cannibalism can be a bit much. For the first time, I was presented with what my religion must look like to people who were ignorant of Catholicism and what it entails. Growing up in the South, where Catholic churches are rare, I never really lived an all-encompassing Catholic lifestyle. For reference, I was raised Irish Catholic, which is essentially the same as Roman Catholicism, but without any of the guilt or fear.
Then I never sin again material, because let's face it, we've been there before. You know it's balls, I know it's balls.
For the longest time, I assumed all Catholics performed Catholicness the way my family did. We went to church every Sunday, sure, or most Sundays at least, so long as we didn't have other plans. I sat through CCD lessons afterwards, standing for the Confraternity of Christian Doctrine, essentially Catholic Sunday School. Every week for years. I wore my white dress for confirmation. I memorized the prayers. But these things felt like a kind of hobby. We did not talk about religion outside of religious settings. We did not say grace over the dinner table or pray every evening right before bed. As a child, I believed those things to be Hollywood make-believe. My house had its own separation between church and state. Our Catholicism was within us, always, like an organ, present but unthought of. Professor Tom Inglis of the School of Social Science at the University of Dublin once quoted a study stating that 17% of Irish Catholics did not believe in life after death, and 44% did not believe in hell, but a high number of them still went to Mass once a month or more. Inglis said, "Is this evidence of a new type of Catholic who likes to go to Mass for the experience and sense of community, a case of belonging without believing?" In the same academic paper, Inglis had originally pointed out that a majority of Irish Catholics no longer respected the institutional church. He asked, "Are Irish Catholics believing without belonging?" Within all organized religions, you will find a population who are conservative in nature. They promote tradition over change, even if that change is necessary for the health and happiness and safety of the group. Catholicism is no different. A subset referred to as traditional Catholics, or tradcasts for short, are quick to decry any criticism of the institutional church as anti-Catholic sentiment. Any mention of church scandal, whether historical or recent, is met with debate and insistent victimization. Facts are pushed aside in favor of defense of not the faith itself, but the men who wield it. Still, some Catholics, like many members of organized religion, are not so quick to dismiss critique. There will always be zealots, and there will always be people who recognize the necessity of change and evolution. In the simplest words, it makes sense for any organization to evolve and adapt with the shifting times, in order to better itself and also to ensure the best treatment of its members. This includes organized religion. The faith itself is not the central issue. Instead, it is the human hands surrounding it that are being questioned and fine-tuned. If even one priest or bishop is allowed to mishandle that faith, and the people who trust him, then the entire parish is poisoned. People in any role of power or caretaking must be held at a higher standard, because their range of possible harm stretches much wider. One bad apple spoils the bunch. This warning is spotlighted in Midnight Mass, and in fact should take part in every work that attempts to analyze or represent the Catholic Church. It is not enough to hold accountable one man who abused the power of his cloth. The people who looked away and allowed the abuse must also be disavowed. Otherwise, you have only plucked the most rotten apple from the pail. You have not inspected the rest for dark spots. You have not cleaned the rot out. Of course, not every piece of media involving Catholicism is attempting to analyze or represent it at all. Namely, Catholicism in horror movies tends to be more of a game of telephone than anything else. By the time that theology reaches the big screen, it's been so misheard and miscommunicated that it's become something else entirely. In his review of Carpenter's Vampires, Ebert goes on to say, John Carpenter's Vampires gets its imprimatur from the Hollywood Catholic Church, a branch that broke off about the time the priest climbed the stairs to Linda Blair's bedroom in The Exorcist. So, of course, we cannot discuss Catholicism and horror without talking about the Hollywood Catholic exorcism.
La maggioranza degli esorcisti sa benissimo che la maggior parte delle persone che si rivolgono a loro non hanno problemi di possessione, ma hanno problemi psichiatrici.
Dr. Cantelmi is the head of the Association of Italian Catholic Psychiatrists and Psychologists. He's a practicing psychiatrist and one of the course lecturers.
Molte patologie psichiatriche somigliano alla possessione, per esempio alcune forme di schizofrenia, alcune forme di deliri. Ora, il punto fondamentale è distinguere fra ciò che è psichiatrico e ciò che psichiatrico non è.
The Exorcist, while undeniably a member of the Hollywood Catholic Church, perhaps even a part of the Hollywood Catholic clergy, has the distinction of being written by a devout member of the real-life Catholic Church. William Peter Blatty based his 1971 novel The Exorcist on the successful exorcism of a 14-year-old Maryland boy in 1949. Its Georgetown setting was not random. Blatty himself was a Georgetown University alumni, and his later years were spent criticizing the university for eschewing its historically Catholic roots and becoming more secular in the late 20th century. Now, I like The Exorcist. It was one of the first true horror classics I ever saw, and I have a visceral memory of waking up during a sleepover to find the DVD menu playing, lighting up the dark basement with its eerie music and flickering screen. But it's impossible to ignore the story's trad-cath message. The story centers around two priests, one older and tested, one younger and doubtful, who are called upon to perform an exorcism on a 12-year-old girl who has been possessed by an evil spirit. Possessions are a relatively straightforward horror plot these days, but the 1973 film certainly helped pave the way. And nearly every inch, both of the book and adaptation, is embedded with a deep discomfort with gender and sexuality. The sexuality of women and girls in particular is an evil of its own in The Exorcist. Regan, the possessed girl, is well behaved and on the edge of puberty, thrust over the threshold into the infamous demonic crucifix masturbation scene. In this scene, Regan's mother finds her 12-year-old daughter covered in blood, stabbing herself repeatedly with a crucifix. In the book version of this scene, which is more graphic, it's stated that Regan orgasmed, furthering the masturbation idea. Except it isn't really Regan stabbing herself, or masturbating. It's the demon inside her, using Regan's own hand to horrifically rape her. That is what this story, and subsequently almost all stories of possession, are, at their core, a rape narrative. That Blatty changed the real-life inspiration for his book from a 14-year-old boy to a 12-year-old girl is intentional. That he changed the real-life boy's married, conservative Lutheran parents to a liberal, atheist single mother for Regan is intentional. We are given to understand that because Regan's mother is trying and failing to do the work of two parents, more concerned with her career than with overseeing her child, these are the true gateways for the devil: atheism, liberalism, single motherhood. Then, when Regan's mother takes her to a rotating cast of doctors and psychiatrists who do more harm than good, we can add modern medicine to the list. In the end, only the determination and sacrifice of Catholic priests can save her daughter. I'm not going to rehash the entirety of the 48-year-old film. Suffice it to say that many of its ingredients became stock for modern horror as we know it, including the perils of gender and sexuality, where any amount of deviance from the traditional cannot go unpunished. And of course, the Catholic exorcism became a staple in stories of possession. Even the family involved in the true 1949 case believed that. They were devout, lifelong German Lutherans, but when it was believed a demon was involved, it was a Jesuit priest they called. Today, actual exorcisms are far more common in fundamentalist Christian groups, particularly Pentecostals, than Catholicism. But in the Church of Hollywood, the Catholic exorcism still reigns supreme. Godhood is just like girlhood, a begging to be believed. Churching by Kristen Chang. In the decades after The Exorcist opened people's eyes to the potential of the possession story, it spawned 2 sequels and 2 versions of the same prequel, almost each worse than the last. The sadder, original prequel was released in 2005 to near universal dislike. Also released in 2005 was a different, subtler exorcism movie, The Exorcism of Emily Rose. Emily Rose, like the original Exorcist, draws inspiration from a true story, that of Anneliese Michel in 1976. Unlike the exorcism that spawned The Exorcist, Anneliese's exorcism failed and she died. The Exorcism of Emily Rose is less about the exorcism itself and more about its aftermath and the events that led up to it. If The Exorcist's head-spinning, pea-soup spewing, puss-dripping Reagan painted the original picture of what a possessed person looks like, Emily Rose rewrote it. Jennifer Carpenter, who played Emily with Juilliard fervor, said that Scott Derrickson, the director, told her to imagine all the cliches you can think of when you hear that word exorcism, and let's move as far away from it as possible, because if it's not new, it's not going to be in the movie. The movements of her body are distinctly discomforting to watch because they are so rigid and extreme, but they are also all very real. Everything Emily Rose does is something which is physically possible for a human being to do, from activating both vocal cords simultaneously to folding the body up like a pretzel on the floor. Carpenter's take on possession was a literal one. While Linda Blair performed Pazuzu-controlled Reagan as if she was a different being altogether, Carpenter moved her body like a marionette on strings, inspired by the art of kabuki theater. While Reagan is unconscious to her possession and exorcism, Emily is completely aware of what is happening to her soul, and to her body, which makes it all the more horrifying. She has bouts of lucidity where she attempts to wrench her life and body back, but is forced under again every time. At least, this is a possible reality that is posed to us. In actuality, The Exorcism of Emily Rose separates itself from its Exorcist film predecessors by leaving the fact of possession up to debate. The central question asked by the film is an age-old one in the history of Catholic exorcisms. Is it demonic, or is it mental illness? This is also the question posed to the court in the film's trial, where Father Moore is accused of negligent homicide. The prosecution maintains that because he suggested Emily stop taking her epileptic medication, she died. Meanwhile, Moore's defense is one that cannot be proven in a court of law. Emily was demonically possessed, and taking her epilepsy medication caused the exorcism to fail. The film presents both sides as equally viable simply by never portraying the demons as fact. This is an anomaly in religion-based horror movies which exist in a world wherein evil spirits are understood to be real. Even if the protagonist questions or is dismissive of their existence at the beginning, there is always the turning point, where the devil is revealed and the supernatural accepted. Only by accepting its existence can it be overcome. Emily accepted the existence of the 6 demons dwelling within her, and so did Father Moore. Defense attorney Erin Bruner admits she's more skeptical and agnostic at the start of the film. It isn't that she doesn't believe in anything, it's that she doesn't know what she believes in. As such, Erin represents both the jury and the audience. In America, it's safe to say that out of 12 random people, you'll probably land on a few who practice some kind of faith, alongside some who don't. And multiply that by the hundreds when it comes to the people watching the film. Atheists watching Emily Rose have claimed it insinuates the demonic version is true, while Christians watching Emily Rose have claimed the opposite. I believe it walks the tightrope between the two fairly well, not siding with either position too heavily. Is it possible that Emily Rose was an epileptic going through an intense psychosis which manifested in such a way as to appear like possession? Yes. Is it possible that she really was possessed? Who can say? Emily was the only person who could explain what she was seeing and feeling, and her words went unbelieved. Emily Rose is treated with a distinct care and sympathy which Regan is not, by virtue of Pazuzu Regan being so over-the-top vulgar and disgusting that it's easy to forget you're watching the horrible rape of a 12-year-old girl. Emily Rose never allows you to forget that, whether the demons are real or not, whether she's epileptic or not, she's a frightened girl who is suffering, and no one knows how to help her, not even the priest. A great deal of importance is put on the idea of telling Emily Rose's story, but Emily Rose's story is never truly told. Instead, it is described by the people who knew her. Even her own words, in a final letter written the day after her failed exorcism, is read in court by Father Moore, not Emily. This is still more agency than Regan was ever afforded. Emily, in the end, felt that she had a choice in her suffering. Regan didn't remember suffering anything at all. After her exorcism, she reverted completely back into the one-dimensional, well-behaved, and pious girl she was before the possession, unchanged and unaffected by what had happened to her. Many possession movies have come out since Emily Rose, most of them taking their cues from Carpenter's rigid bodywork. The Devil Inside, a 2011 found-footage film about a woman seeking answers to her mother's failed exorcism, even cast a professional contortionist in the part of a possessed woman. This was the only good decision they made. Then, in 2016, a sequel to The Exorcist, but in the form of a television series on Fox. Like the original 1973 film, it centers on two priests, the elder, a traveling exorcist, and the younger, consumed with doubt. Like the original, the victim is a young girl. Like the original, the show deals with gender and sexuality, but that's where the similarities end. While the 1971 novel and adaptation revile women and women's sexuality, the show embraces both in the form of Kat, one of the main sisters, who is mourning the sudden death of her best friend and first love. Their relationship is always treated with gentle respect, and never demeaned for being comprised of two young women. Also treated with simple dignity is the fact that Father Marcus, the exorcist himself, is gay, and comfortable with it. These characters and their stories existing in the same franchise that started as an unsubtle critique of feminism and sexuality is just another example in a thankfully growing pool of diverse lives being centered in modern horror. Father Marcus's role as a gay priest at peace with himself and his sexuality is a particularly salient topic for the Catholic Church, which in 2005 released a Vatican document instructing that the Church cannot admit to the seminary or to holy orders those who practice homosexuality, present deep-seated homosexual tendencies, or support the so-called gay culture. Such persons, in fact, find themselves in a situation that gravely hinders them from relating correctly to men and women. Essentially, they outlawed gay priests, and nuns, and deacons, etc. Obviously, this didn't stop gay men from becoming priests. There have always been gay priests, and nuns, and deacons, etc., whether the Vatican believes so or not. It would have been easy to sanitize Father Marcus, making him devoid of sex and sensuality and thus technically not sinful. The Catholic Church, unlike many of their Protestant cousins, does not believe homosexuality in itself is a sin. This does not, shockingly, mean their doctrine is free of homophobia. While homosexuality is not inherently sinful, homosexual acts definitely are. In fact, the Catechism of the Catholic Church, which outlines the Church's dogmas and teachings, describes homosexual acts as intrinsically immoral and contrary to the natural law, and describes homosexual tendencies as objectively disordered. The Catechism also states that homosexual persons are called to chastity, before going on to maintain that such persons must be accepted with respect and sensitivity. Every sign of unjust discrimination in their regard should be avoided. So, they can deny you jobs and invalidate your relationships and say you're contrary to the natural law, but they can't, be rude about it. But instead of milking this loophole and avoiding direct conflict with the doctrine, The Exorcist shows a recently defrocked Marcus cheerfully kiss another man, intending to fully lean into those intrinsically immoral tendencies without guilt or hesitation. The only thing that had kept him from romantically or sexually seeking out men before had been his religious vows of chastity, the kind every priest is expected to uphold regardless of sexuality. In fact, while Father Marcus was respecting his vows, it was his heterosexual counterpart, Father Thomas, who was breaking them, with a married woman no less. Talk about immoral tendencies. However, this too was treated with fairness and sympathy. After all, we're all only human, collar or not. We're all susceptible to human failings. Which leads me to the part of the show that cements its distinction from its Exorcist predecessors. Casey, Cass's younger sister, is possessed, and we are given the story of her possession by seeing it from her own eyes. We see the demon, called Mr. Howdy, slowly attempt to seduce, manipulate, and finally abuse and overtake Casey. We see her try to fight back. Casey is a victim, but she is given a voice and nuance that the pure and innocent girl victims of possession films so seldom are. Casey hates Mr. Howdy's control of her body, but when that control is used to defend herself and her mentally ill father against sexual harassment, she is obviously conflicted. She is allowed to be conflicted and a victim at the same time. And when Casey's mother, a grown Regan all along, sacrifices herself and grants Pazuzu entrance into her body to protect her daughter, it's Casey, not the priests, who ultimately saves the day. We're also given a look into Regan's mind in the weeks leading up to her possession, the one that started it all. Decades after The Exorcist, Regan gets to tell her story. The show reached back in time to grant a little girl agency. Yes, this is me saying you should watch the Exorcist TV show. But exorcisms are not the only core tenet of the Hollywood Catholic Church. If there aren't demons, you can be sure there are vampires.
I really hope that those guys don't kill those police, because it will mean more police will come, possibly even Christians, which is totally the last thing we need in this house.
In 1995, Pope John Paul II released a list of 45 films, referred to by many as the Vatican Film List. The list was titled Some Important Films and separated into 3 categories with 15 films in each: religion, values, and art. In the art category is the 1922 silent film Nosferatu, the first vampire film itself. Nosferatu is almost identical to Dracula in plot, with only the names and ending changed and one significant detail. Vampires could no longer go out into the sunlight. If they did, they burned. There's a persistent rumor that the names were changed to avoid copyright infringement, though the filmmaker was vocal about it being based on the 1897 novel. Perhaps because of that, Stoker's family sued the production company and won, with the courts ordering all copies of the film destroyed. Nosferatu proved as difficult to kill as its namesake, however. At least one copy had survived and been internationally distributed, only for hundreds of copies to be made and shared. As such, Nosferatu also became one of the first cult classics. In the centuries since Nosferatu first brought the vampire to life, there have been countless new iterations, some less Hollywood Catholic than others. Though many non-religious vampire films have difficulty fully divorcing themselves from Christianity, given Christianity's deeply embedded roots in the modern vampire mythos. The 2011 abomination Priest, for instance, whose titular hero quite literally is a vampire-killing priest raised and trained by a capital C church with a crucifix tattooed on his face. But of course, the film itself isn't religious. Not all vampire films have a Christian overture, of course. The fantastic Iranian vampire film A Girl Walks Home Alone at Night has not one rosary or crucifix to be found. The Swedish coming-of-age horror Let the Right One In is also noticeably free from the usual weapons. But films like these are pearls among sand. Mostly, there's just sand. And some vampire media embraces its Catholic identity, not only leaning into the usual vampire tropes, but interrogating them. Why do vampires and Catholicism have such an intertwining history? What do they have in common? I mean, I get that we say we drink the blood of Christ, which is really just cheap, bad wine and all, but is there anything else? That's what Midnight Mass asks, among many, many, many other questions. The 7-episode series centers on a tiny fishing town called Crockett Island, whose community has been economically decimated by a recent oil spill. It is also primarily Catholic. Everything about Crockett Island is world-wearied and run down, from the streets to the houses to the church. Only one building in the whole town is clean and new. The rec center, which was recently constructed thanks to donations to the church coerced from everyone by resident catechism know-it-all Bev Keane. Also in the motley cast are Riley, an altar boy grown up into an atheist, struggling with sobriety after his drunk driving killed a young girl, and Hassan, the Muslim sheriff newly migrated from the city after being racially harassed, only to then be racially harassed in the otherwise very white, very Catholic, insulated small town. Crockett Island felt uncomfortably reflective of my father's hometown, where my parents have both retired. Replace small seaside island with small mountain town, and replace the fishing industry with the dairy one, the oil spill with fracking runoff, and it is essentially a window into that element of my life, complete with Bev Keane know-it-alls and microaggressions. Small town mentality, depending on the people who make up the town of course, can quickly become an echo chamber. When you're surrounded by people who see and think like you, all bouncing the same thoughts and opinions back at each other, no matter if they're unfounded or wrong, it can be difficult to pull your head above water and look at things a different way. Historically, deviance from the culturally accepted norm has not had much of a success rate. In Midnight Mass, we see this in the treatment of Riley's atheism, and, more aggressively, the consistent disrespect of Hassan's existence as a brown man and Muslim. They literally call him Sharif instead of Sheriff. The show begins with the arrivals of both Riley, newly released from prison, and a young priest called Father Paul, who is replaced in the island's own elderly Monsignor Pruitt after he took ill on his sabbatical. The story takes place over the weeks of Lent, beginning shortly before Ash Wednesday and ending with Easter. For those of you who don't know, Lent is a Catholic, kept by some Protestants, tradition recognizing the 40 days Jesus spent surviving in the desert and denying the temptation of Satan. Typically, it lasts all of March and the first 2 weeks of April, ending on Easter Sunday, which is the celebration of Jesus' resurrection. During Lent, it's common for Catholics to sacrifice something out of piety. In my experience, it's usually used as a way to diet or a kind of New Year's resolution too. Ash Wednesday is typically the beginning of Lent, during which the priest will anoint parishioners' foreheads with ashes in the shape of a cross with the words, "Remember that you are dust, and to dust you shall return." Sometimes it's hard to listen to traditional Catholic dicturns and not think, wow, this wasn't written with vampires in mind. Midnight Mass is dripping with traditional Catholicism. Father Paul and the altar boys burning palm leaves in buckets for the Ash Wednesday service. The mayor commenting on Father Paul's use of the Old Mass translation, a contention Catholics have been dealing with since the Church announced the new, more literal and clunky translation in 2011. Mike Flanagan himself was raised Catholic in his hometown of Salem, Massachusetts. He was also an altar boy, and boy, you can tell. The whole show feels like a careful interrogation. Even within the criticisms, there is love. In order for us to criticize, we must care. We want the church and our neighbors in faith to do better, to be better. Everything about Midnight Mass is questioning, picking up the question of faith and analyzing it, like Riley himself says he did. Hassan and his son Ali exist to pose the question, why Catholicism and not a different religion? If the miracle of the vampire is faith-based, why are some faiths prioritized over others? Could a loving God pick and choose? Should we? In Joe's story, a sloppy old drunkard whose carelessness resulted in the paralysis of a young girl, slowly beginning the difficult climb towards sobriety, we are given the question, who is worth forgiveness? Redemption? Obviously the moral answer, the so-called Christian answer, should be everyone. But, as is usually the case within something so fallible as organized religion, we are instead shown that some people are deemed worthier than others. After all, Riley's own drunken carelessness resulted in the death of a young girl. But he is far more readily embraced and forgiven by his community. After all, no matter his current pesky questioning, he was once an altar boy. He was one of them, and his victim wasn't. Eventually, it's revealed that Father Paul is actually Monsignor Pruitt. He encountered a vampire during his time abroad, whose blood de-aged him. Father Paul, believing the vampire to be an angel of the Lord, whose miracle blood could save the town and people he loved, brought the creature back with him to Crockett Island. He began tainting the communion wine with the blood, which resulted in Riley's mother no longer needing glasses, Dr. Sarah's dying mother becoming lucid, and Lisa, the girl paralyzed by Joe, beginning to walk. It all seems very miraculous, disregarding the legions of dead cats and the slaughtered teenager. Things come to a head when Father Paul has a seizure and dies violently, only to then wake up as though nothing happened. But of course, something did happen. He died and was resurrected, a little more bloodthirsty and sun-averse than before. There have been similarities drawn in the past between vampires and the nature of addiction, their lust for blood driving them sometimes beyond reason or recognition. How fitting, then, that Father Paul, who has been presiding over the AA meetings for Riley and Joe in the island's rec center, licks Joe's blood off the floor as he lay dying, just as Joe might have once done with spilled beer. And Father Paul might have seen him do it, looking on with pity. Now the roles are reversed. Father Paul is the one who cannot control his urges, and Joe is the one who pays the price. If Father Paul's explanation for his bringing the angel back with him in a suitcase is to be believed, he had only good intentions. He only wanted to help his parishioners, his home. In reality, while I do think he wanted to help them, his true motivations were far from selfless. He and the woman he loved were both aging into senility and ungraceful deaths. He wanted to bring his cure to her, so they might finally have a life together, the way they couldn't manage before. Not even knowing if she wanted the same, spoiler, she didn't, he let this fantasy blind him to the reality of the vampire and its horrors. Against her will, and the will of everyone else at St. Patrick's, he began to cure the island of its very humanity. This forced conversion of a sort is reminiscent of the Catholic Church's history of forcing itself onto others. Jewish and Muslim people, indigenous people, just about anywhere a Catholic majority country colonized, the Church took drastic measures to convince others to convert. This is but one of many violent hypocrisies within the Church's history, given how much importance is given to the gift of free will. Our ability to choose our own paths in life is what makes us human. But, as with all institutions of power, some people had their paths chosen for them. In the case of Midnight Mass, Father Paul chose the vampire path for his parishioners, whether they wanted it or not. By the time Father Paul realizes his mistake, he's too late. St. Patrick's and the rest of Crockett Island have been lost. Bev Keane, the the most extreme example of zealotry in the show, is also forced to confront what she claimed to believe in. You are dust, and to dust you shall return. After the majority of the parishioners have been convinced to kill themselves by drinking poison, and thus reawaken as vampires, a baptism of sorts, and an obvious hearkening to the real-life cult massacre of Jonestown, Bev says about her unbaptized heathen neighbors, "Let God sort them out." But at the end, when her own sorting is staring down at her, Bev is terrified to face it, implying she doesn't believe God's all too keen on her after all. But even though Bev is the show's primary antagonist, more easy to hate than even the Nosferatu-esque monster, the rest of the townsfolk are not let off the hook. They all played a part in the destruction of their home and loved ones, either by inactive passivity in the name of conforming, or by outright succumbing to the militant zealotry proposed first by Father Paul and then Bev and resulting in a massacre. Early in the series, Hassan and the other parents are having a meeting at the schoolhouse. Hassan is rightfully concerned about the Bible being taught in the public school, pointing out that if the tables were turned and he gave out Qurans at the school, Bev Keane would likely run him from town. Bev then puts on a one-woman show of victimhood so completely disingenuous that it's painful to watch. Not one person in the room disagreed with her, despite the lukewarm attempts of Erin, Riley's childhood sweetheart, who eventually just gives up and lets Bev bulldoze her way through as usual. At the end of her insufferable self-victimizing, Bev receives a round of applause from the other almost all-white and all-Catholic parents. It is a perfect, painful scene that completely encapsulates the show. Even when the parishioners aren't committing terrible acts, they are allowing them to happen. In one of Riley's rambling rebukes of God, he demands to know, why does God allow suffering? Midnight Mass, in turn, asks, why do we? I've seen complaints from people that Midnight Mass, like the rest of Flanagan's projects, is too wordy for its own good. Mike Flanagan is clearly a fan of monologues. But unlike the near-perfect Haunting of Bly Manor, whose wordiness never feels overlong, and even the clumsier Haunting of Hill House, whose monologues often feel somewhat out of place, Midnight Mass has a built-in reasoning for its long-windedness. In each episode, the characters are giving a homily. The homily is the sermon of a Catholic Mass delivered by the priest. It is usually long, taking up a third to half of the Mass itself, and depending on the priest, it can be quite tedious. I've fallen asleep to many a homily, simply because the priest wasn't a good speaker, or the speech itself wasn't interesting. At its core, a homily is meant to inspire a closer reading of one's own faith. A great homily urges you to question what it is you believe in, and why you believe in it, and how you might be able to see things differently. Giving each character, Catholic or not, religious or not, a chance at questioning and answering, delivering their own reading of the text, does ensure the pace of the series is slow, but it never feels unsteady. Midnight Mass manages to separate itself from the Hollywood Catholic Church. Once Father Paul fully embraces vampirism, he does not hiss and recoil at the sight of a crucifix or burst into flames when he steps into the church. The vampire, or angel as he calls it, is likewise also able to step into the church without issue. They can touch and consume the Eucharist. In fact, Father Paul folds vampirism into his faith seamlessly. At the series' end, as the sun rises and returns everyone to dust, they're all praying. Hassan and Ali are praying on the beach. St. Patrick's parishioners, blood-soaked and horrified, stand grouped together, singing one last communal hymn. They have done terrible things, and have had terrible things done to them, and they will either be forgiven or not. But they go in peace, and peace be with them. In this way, Midnight Mass and The Exorcist might be ushering in a new type of Hollywood Catholic Church, trading crucifix sizzling and gunslinger priests for something a little more honest.